Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Susan Hearn, CEO of Germane Solutions, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, Charting New Paths, the New Teaching Hospital's Journey. After today's webinar, participants will have learned more about the comprehensive process of transitioning from a non-teaching to a teaching hospital, understand the strategic and financial motivations for pursuing GME, be able to identify and mitigate the most common early challenges that occur while developing GME, and recognize the long-term impact of becoming a teaching hospital. Before I introduce today's panelists, there's a couple of logistical items I want to cover. Participants have been muted upon entry to the session. However, sometimes it doesn't work. If your audio is showing as unmuted, please mute yourself to eliminate background noise during the presentation. We've made every effort to reduce technical issues with the webinar presentation. If you have problems of any kind, please indicate them in a private chat to Hunter Rich on the platform. The slide presentation and the webinar broadcast are provided exclusively for the use of registrants and should not be shared. Reproducing, distributing, or transmitting any session materials or the live presentation to any other groups or individuals requires express permission from Germane Solutions. If you have questions throughout the session, please submit them in the chat feature. There will be a dedicated question and answer time at the end of the session. If we're not able to get through all the questions in time, then we'll have a question, and you have a question that we'll include in the email afterwards. We have a chat facilitator, Kelsey Barnes. She'll be taking questions through the chat feature. So if you have a question, please place it there. Every registered participant for the session will receive an email containing a link to our survey so we can obtain feedback on the webinar. The survey is brief and we encourage your comments. Now let me introduce today's panelists. Susan Greenwood-Clark and Courtney Matteson. Susan is a senior specialist and brings over 25 years of healthcare experience to Germane Solutions. She spent the last 20 years focused on GME, and her background includes healthcare strategic planning, residency program development, program accreditation and achievement and oversight, CME reimbursement, compliance, and financial management of GME resources. Additionally, Courtney has 22 years of healthcare experience and has spent the last 6 years focused on graduate medical education. Her background includes GME, system strategies, new program development for residency and fellowship programs, GME office leadership roles, and system-wide educational institution roles. Now let's begin. Germane has developed a roadmap that we use in helping organizations make the transition to teaching. The map includes quite a few steps, incorporating strategic transition, operational feasibility, financial forecasting. During the webinar today, the panelists will be talking about each of these. In the first step, in the pre-planning, hospitals need to consider several factors when determining if they're going to transition to a teaching hospital. Addressing physician shortages is often a key consideration, as GME programs can attract and retain talent, particularly in underserved areas, while creating a future pipeline of staff. Hospitals might also weigh the potential to advance research and innovation. This brings access to grants and the ability to implement cutting-edge treatments. Finally, improving patient outcomes is another area that we see commonly. Reducing areas through resident involvement can be a very important advantage. And as a bonus for financial benefits, Medicare GME payments and cost savings from resident labor are further appeal to this transition. We'll begin the panel questions with the first step as we walk you through this process, which is the pre-planning stage. For the first question, what did you find to be the most compelling motivations for your hospital when transitioning to a teaching hospital? What role did these motivations play in the decision-making process? We'll start this one with you, Susan.
Hello, everyone. For our organization, we realized during our physician workforce planning that we had a large number of physicians who were aging out of the workforce. And so we really needed to find a strategic advantage that was going to replace them. We also were benefited with a very high Medicare population within the hospital environment. So with that, we were able to align our goals with the hospital and get pretty significant reimbursement under GME financing to support our initiatives to move forward. These initiatives helped us really grow our training programs in a very short period of time.
Thank you. I've had the opportunity personally to work with Courtney and her organization that she came from on various aspects of GME, one of which was medical school partnerships, and that being a powerful motivator for the organization to begin. Courtney, anything to add?
Yes, thank you, Susan. So as you said, Germane was engaged by my former institution several years ago, back in 2017, to really help us assess the feasibility of beginning new GME programs in concert with a local effort to develop a brand new College of Medicine at a college not too far from the health system main campus. And so really what we did, in addition to what Susan talks about for primary motivators being a homegrown pipeline of physicians coming in to not only replace the retiring folks, but also to support some of our service line expansion goals. We really wanted to make sure there was a strong partnership and alignment between the College of Medicine strategy and the health system strategy. So really my experience has been that the Germane team was able to work hand in hand with both the health system leadership and those engaged in the various boards of the College of Medicine planning to tailor very specific strategic feasibilities to address both of those needs for our health system, which was very helpful.
Thank you both. That leads us into the next area of strategy development. Germane Solutions partners with hospital leadership to develop customized strategies that align with the hospital's mission, vision, and community needs. The step ensures that the GME program supports the broader institutional objectives, as well as expanding clinical services, enhancing patient care, and addressing workforce shortages. Through a collaborative approach, Germane helps identify strategic priorities. We set measurable goals and ensure that all stakeholders have a shared understanding of the long-term vision. The foundation allows the hospital to proceed confidently into feasibility assessment with a clear plan and defined objectives guiding the entire process. Question here is, how did Germane Solutions help your hospital develop a tailored GME strategy? What initial goals and priorities did your hospital have, and how did Germane Solutions ensure the strategy was aligned with your hospital's broader mission? We'll start with you, Courtney.
Awesome. Thank you, Susan. So I will say that the Germane team was really critical to our GME strategy success as a health system coming from a very non-academic environment, trying to transition into a fully aligned College of Medicine academic partnership. There was a number of areas that Germane was able to provide expert insights on across the board as we were meeting with our senior leadership teams, our strategy teams, operations, nursing, you name it. And so they were really able to come in, help describe the common benefits for new GME programs, which included a multitude of things, quality of care enhancements, our patient care coverage and expansion model planning, and that pipeline need that we would have for those particular physician specialties. They helped with showcasing multiple avenues of community benefit and then the direct and indirect financial benefits of building the new GME cap, which were advantageous to our system, which is always very helpful when you're thinking through these strategies. Additionally, they were really able to talk to the typical challenges of implementing a GME strategy, things in terms of GME infrastructure, faculty development, medical staff engagement, and just general community support for transitioning into a more teaching-centered hospital. And finally, some best practices for developing our clinical learning environment, which included integrating our medical students from the proposed College of Medicine, a number of other clinical learners in our space, and then the overall educational strategy for all those groups. And so to the second part of the question, Susan, I think of concern to my health system were both the operational management strategy and then the affordability of incorporating this into our financial planning models. And really what Germane was able to come in and do when I was over on the client side was to articulate a really customized roadmap for our operational success that incorporated all the constraints that are contained within trying to build a program within that 5-year CMS cap building period, maximize our revenue opportunities, and making sure that we had had robust financial pro forma models at both the system and the program level to really help generate a lot of that buy-in from that perspective.
Thank you, Courtney. Sounds like you had a lot of time available to get everything right in your plan. I know oftentimes there's not the luxury of that long timeline, even so in the pre-planning part and getting things ready and through the strategic, but also as you're building. Susan, did you have some experiences around that?
Yes, we actually built our program under the 3-year time frame that was initially put in by the CMS organization. So our build had to be pretty quick. Our initial goals were very modest, but we were very fortunate to find Germane to come in and help us with really providing a strategic plan for us. And we ended up expanding our plan to over 150 resident FTEs over a 3-year period. We aligned our strategy with the hospital's objectives to increase our financial or our physician capacity. And with the experts with Germane, we were allowed to grow very strategically and exponentially. Germane was actually very helpful to us because they evaluated the areas that we really felt that we could support physician expansion. And that allowed us then to put those programs into place pretty quickly.
Thank you. The next phase is the initial feasibility assessment. Here, Germane collaborates with hospital leadership to explore the potential for GME. By doing this, we conduct a holistic analysis of the system's clinical capabilities, existing educational resources, and physician availability, while identifying gaps a GME program could address. A critical aspect of this process is assessing physician buy-in through interviews, steering committee discussions, as well as their willingness to support and participate, which is essential for developing high-quality programs. This assessment also helps determine the most sustainable resident program, the most suitable one that's available, as well as the recommended program sizes. Additionally, it provides the opportunity to identify and address any gaps that may need to be resolved to support other specialty areas effectively. Question here is, how did Germane Solutions help your hospital navigate the initial feasibility assessment process? What was your hospital's biggest concern, and how did Germane Solutions address it? Courtney, do you want to go first?
Sure, absolutely. So for my experience, the Germane team really started off strong with a very robust initial data request that was focused on capturing all of our localized data in terms of medical staff, volumes, community impact, everything you might imagine that goes into this type of assessment. And really, the team took the time to understand the overall system needs, as Susan Greenwood spoke to, making sure that we aligned that with our priorities, our growth plans, and then utilized all of that information in the feasibility process to really inform the initial recommendations. Our work also included a really robust initial visioning session that ended up spanning into a number of sessions actually with the leadership of the health system, leadership of each hospital, and other key members of our medical staff to ensure that all of the proper priorities, alignments, medical staff availability, and volumes were really captured appropriately in that initial assessment. And then from there, after executing all of those tasks, reviewing a large wealth of data, mountains and mountains that we provided, the Germane team was able to develop a clear and targeted recommendation for us to develop both our new sponsoring institution and also all of our targeted locally recommended GME programs. They mapped out a beautiful plan to ensure that we could accomplish all of the foundational builds within that CAP building period, and then really made sure that all of the measures were in place for the next phases of work we'll start talking about to really get all of the buy-in required to do such a large build in such a small amount of time.
Thank you. It's a lot of work.
It is.
Yeah, Germane has worked with over 70 organizations now to become new teaching organizations, and we've started over 400 programs. So we certainly had a lot of experience here. And, through this work, our data mining capabilities and modeling capabilities have significantly grown over the years, really enhancing our ability to provide very tailored feasibility assessments. Susan, would you like to add your experience?
Yeah, I will say during Germane's initial work with us, it was very strategic. And one of the things that we had to do was, since we had to build our CAP very quickly, we made a strategic decision to grow a very large transitional year program. And in doing that, it allowed us to go back later after the CAP building process was complete and reshape those FTEs into other specialty areas that were needed by the hospital. So because of that feasibility that was done, we were able to go back later and talk about feasibility for fellowships and other training program expansions. The data mining that Germane did was very helpful for us as we went through that process.
Thank you. So moving on to the next one, educational and administrative knowledge building. Many hospital teams don't fully understand the complexities of GME. Germane guides them through the necessary knowledge, focusing on accreditation requirements, financial implications, and how GME integrates into existing operations. This empowers hospital leadership to make informed decisions. Our question here is, when working on GME education and knowledge building, how did your hospital leadership's knowledge evolve? Was there a pivotal moment when their perspectives shifted? Susan, would you like to go first?
I would say in general, because this process started at the board level, leadership was extremely supportive of the plan moving forward. But we needed to really educate our physicians on what the benefits of GME were for them as physicians working in the environment, and making sure that they understood it was beneficial and not a threat to their own livelihood. So what was really nice was Germane was able to actually help us identify the faculty best suited to fit into our teaching roles, and they help support recruitment of program leadership to develop the GME structures.
Thank you. Each organization definitely has very unique critical stakeholders. They typically fall, though, however, within administrative, clinical, physician, and other leadership roles. Very important that we provide the customized education that we need. Courtney, what was your experience?
So unfortunately, unlike Susan's institution, it was a bit more of a lift at my institution. So we had very strong support from our chief medical officer, who was very interested in engaging in this. Relatively good support from our CEO, but the rest of the senior leadership team took a bit more time and a bit more persuasion. So really, our main challenge was getting all the appropriate leaders engaged in the overall planning process, gaining that overall acceptance for the GME strategy, so that we had all key members of the team out there championing with the medical staff for this change. Our education and knowledge building process had to be very inclusive of multiple stakeholders, multiple impacted groups throughout the organization, working with teams from executive leadership, from clinical operations, finance, the medical staff, nursing, facilities, EVS, and food services. So really a holistic view from our perspective. And sort of as we alluded to in the last question, it took a good amount of time. So nearly a year and a half of dedicated effort to begin that shift from a perspective full of concerns and reservations, and really folks starting to dig in their heels to a perspective of more support, more excitement, though that certainly wasn't 100% across the board as we launched our initial programs. So a little bit different of a lift than Susan Greenwood.
Yeah, that is a challenge. And oftentimes when we experience that, a lot of that rolls into kind of our next phase as well, where continued education is important during resource identification planning. In this step, a successful GME program requires significant investment in faculty, infrastructure, and clinical training sites. Germane provides detailed insights into the resources needed, helps hospitals align their operational capacity with the demands of a teaching program, and of course continues to educate, as we were discussing. Courtney, the question for you first is, what is the biggest resource gap your hospital discovered when planning for GME? Was there a specific instance where Germane Solutions helped your organization?
Absolutely.
I'll let you continue.
So as you just heard, for us, it was a process, but really one of the primary areas of challenge that we experienced in the initial transitional journey was our faculty availability and engagement. We were in an institution where many members of our medical staff, particularly the physicians, had joined or actually sought employment with this system because it had a non-teaching status, and that just wasn't their area of interest. So the Germane team was able to partner with the GME leadership team and some of our executive sponsors came in with a multitude of educational resources. They were able to tailor those to some of our specific audiences and specific concerns, and really help to demystify the overall process and faculty expectations as we moved forward. Secondly, space and infrastructure. So as you might imagine, in any established hospital setting, space was at a true premium for us. It took a lot of creativity to try and carve out the dedicated needed educational spaces within our existing hospital campuses that were already relatively space constrained and in need of some new construction enhancements. So again, we leveraged Germane to be an integral part of that planning process, ensuring that all key stakeholders and all executive champions understood the requirements through the ACGME and the typical best practices in our region and nationally to help guide that planning process and our eventual blueprint review and sort of capital improvement recommendations. So really a key partner along the way in providing a lot of those very specific insights, best practices, and what has worked or not worked for past clients was very helpful in shifting that perspective for us.
Thank you. We certainly have seen a lot along that scale, but those are very common gaps that we see in an organization. We find in non-teaching hospitals, physicians often join that hospital because they thought they didn't want to teach. They typically get turned around and many of them participate, but it's definitely one of the biggest things that we see. And I think space is definitely always a premium. Susan, what was your experience?
I would say I will echo exactly what Courtney had to say. We definitely had to do some major recruitment of physicians to fill our initial faculty leadership roles. And we looked across the region. We were very fortunate to live in a very highly concentrated area where you see a lot of physicians. So that the reach wasn't that broad. We could actually find regional leaders, which was very helpful for us. The additional call room space for residents, as well as conference space and workspace, was a bit of a lift. Took a lot of work with me working with a planning individual and walking the square footages within the hospital to find a place where we can actually put residents. What was beneficial for us, though, is we actually, through this strategic initiative, we found a way to build a new tower. And with that tower, we actually designed areas specifically for residents to participate in learning and working within the community of care providers. So that was a huge benefit for us. And through this whole process, Germane was very valuable to us in strategic planning of that space and those faculty resources. And we're really a good mouthpiece for us to share with other leaders as to why this was so important for the organization to set aside this space. Because as you can imagine, when you're in a hospital that's been fully used, they look at that as revenue generating space. So they have to realize that that space has to be dedicated to your providers who are giving you revenue generation in a different way.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the other side of that is how much that costs to renovate that space. Taking us to our next area, which is financial forecasting. So understanding the long-term financial impact of GME development is critical for hospital leadership. This is one area that everyone is interested in, is what does this cost us and what are we going to get? Germane Solutions works closely with leadership to evaluate the economic benefit of GME programs by developing a detailed pro forma. The financial model compares anticipated federal GME reimbursement against program-specific expenses and outlines the economic projections over a 10-year period. By providing a clear picture of potential costs and revenue streams, Germane helps hospitals plan for the future, highlighting the significant financial incentives that GME programs can bring while mitigating potential risks. How did your hospital react to the financial forecast for GME programs? Was there any initial hesitancy due to financial concerns? Susan?
I would say that because this was at the board level, that planning, I think, was very well received by the board. As you can imagine, because we were a hospital that had over 70% of our discharges as Medicare, the numbers looked pretty advantageous for us to grow these programs within the organization. I do believe, though, that the hospital leadership weren't quite as supportive of all the expenses, and they had to understand what the GME reimbursement looked like, so they understood that we had the supports we needed to create these programs and expand the programs. What we also did is I always presented on an annual basis what the current expenses were and the revenue projections were to the board so that they could again feel comfortable that the resources were available to them to continue to expand our programs and meet our objective.
Because it's great if you have a favorable rate with that. We often anticipate some initial hesitancy, even with a very favorable reimbursement rate from hospitals as they begin to evaluate financial forecasts and budgets. Often we find, having not done GME before, that that's related to a lack of understanding and what that all means. Courtney, what was your experience?
Yeah, so tying in, I think exactly with what you were just saying, Susan, and from the client perspective side, since I've joined Germane, in my experience, hospitals and health system leadership often react with an initial sense of concern, regardless of that bottom line impact, whether positive or negative. I think this is typically due to the impacts it's going to have on their short and long-term financial budget planning, financial forecasting, and just the initial hesitancy due to the significant changes that can occur to their past practice structures, both in terms of cost center development, accounting, all of those types of resource needs. So particularly interesting when I'm working with folks where their pro forma provides a really nice net positive margin, as it did in my case, and the hospital leadership and finance teams seem to be unable to internally recognize how that could even be a feasible possibility for them. So really we encounter a lot of pushback on all the assumptions just to test their efficacy. Any of the underlying assumptions or calculations, we often see folks like to go line by line in that perspective. And so in my particular case, there was that initial hesitancy period to trust the modeling, and it took multiple focused review sessions with the finance leads and the CFO to ensure that they were feeling really comfortable with the assumptions, all of the line item costs, the ramp up projections, their ability to plan for some of those initial loss years. Our first 2 years as we were building were going to be projected at a loss, did come through in that case, but then more than make up for it over the lifetime of the program. And so Germane really stepped in to support each step of that process as we reviewed all of the fine details in the pro formas that were developed. They brought in some very high-level finance experts to truly take that client-focused approach to addressing all of the concerns in the room, and were able to also address some very specific concerns with CMS and the MAC, and making sure all of our cost reporting inquiries and connections were correct in terms of that process, because our CFO had a lot of initial concerns around that area. So I think really taking the time to sit with us to help set that up and to make sure all of the folks in the room were comfortable with that, help that move up to, as Susan Green was talking about, that board approval level where everybody could feel comfortable.
Yeah, it really is important. Thank you. The next area is institutional sponsorship and program design. Germane Solutions advises on institutional sponsorship, helping hospitals navigate the regulatory and administrative steps required. We recommend specialties and program sites tailored to the hospital's capacity and community needs. There's quite a few ways that people can do institutional sponsorship, so we certainly help people work through that, but also find that other partnerships are critical for success. Courtney, I know you had some experience with this.
Yeah, so Germane helped work through a number of options for our sponsoring institution setup. We opted in the end for a combined consolidated approach rather than hospital by hospital. So really developing that GME consortium model. And within that, we were able to cover the majority of the services and the educational experience needs of all of the planned programs, but did find it would be much more advantageous and beneficial for our family medicine program to partner with a local, much larger FQHC setting in our area for that continuity clinic experience. I think uniquely, we were in a space where that was not the norm, or that is advanced to be more of the norm in a lot of the programs we've been setting up in recent years. So that really was a both operational and financial puzzle to solve between the GME leadership, the health system leadership, and the FQHC leadership to make sure that we navigated that affiliation agreement appropriately. We were supportive of all the clinical curriculum design, the space planning that needed to occur to make that FQHC a little bit more teaching friendly. And really this attempt took a little bit of fine tuning year over year. It certainly didn't go out of the gate right off the charts in a perfect fashion. So year over year, we would reassess, put some effort into planning a better experience for the following year. So I think really just trying to tie in the goals of both organizations and making sure that the residents had a truly excellent educational experience took a lot more effort in our initial build.
Yeah, those kind of partnerships can be really tricky. Susan, I know you had a couple different models for your continuity clinic. Do you want to talk about some of the partnerships that you forged?
Yeah, we were in a different type of environment. We didn't really have a lot of underserved population within our community. So having relationships with FQHCs were not really available to us. So what we really did was we looked at creating a continuity experience in two different ways. One, we created our own continuity clinic. And then secondly, and that was for the family medicine program, but the internal medicine program, we had this great faculty prior physician practice that partnered with us, and they actually brought their entire group of patients to us as a teaching clinic. And it was already up and functioning, and it had a very large patient base to it. So we didn't struggle with making sure that we could meet the numbers. The family medicine practice, though, did struggle because, again, we didn't have that underserved population we were working with. So the clinic itself could not grow fast enough for the development of our training program. So what we had to do was we had to engage another physician practice who was already functioning so that we could send the residents to that practice in addition to the new practice that we were creating. So based on that, we were able to meet the requirements of the program. And through that journey, Germane was exceptionally valuable because they were able to help us identify what that precepting model might look like, as well as how we can meet the continuity clinic requirements for our practices.
That's great. The next step is timeline development. Transitioning to a teaching hospital is a multi-year process. We help to create a timeline including key milestones such as faculty recruitment, program accreditation, and the arrival of the first residents. The timeline ensures that all the stakeholders are aligned and that the hospital can manage the process efficiently. So what challenges did you face in developing a realistic timeframe for program startup? What adjustments to the timeline did you make to fit unexpected challenges? Susan?
Yeah, because we were required to develop our programs within a 3-year time period, we did start early in developing our programs. We probably started 18 months before we actually kicked off our first resident in the training programs. In our development, we actually started 3 training programs at once as we started the CAP building period, and then we brought 3 additional programs in the second year. So as you can imagine, it was a huge amount of work that we had to undertake in a very fast time period. One of the things, though, that we struggled with was we had to readjust our plan for the internal medicine program. We initially submitted an application with the ACGME to have that 4+1 curriculum structure. And at that point, when we did that, it was a fairly new concept, and ACGME was not really supportive of that. So we had to step back and reclaim a more traditional approach for the internal medicine training program to get it approved. So we were able to do that. We were still able to meet our deadlines to get ourselves started in a certain particular part of the year, and then we move forward. So again, it's really important that you do a lot of that upfront work and really plan very well how you're going to start these training programs and which programs you're going to start and what that timeline needs to look like.
Yeah, that's important. And for those of you that have been around a while, probably remember that 3-year CAP building, which was certainly a huge challenge. Timeline expectations have evolved, with many hospitals now planning over a 5-year period, as you have a 5-year CAP development window to accommodate CAP building and program requirements. But even with that 5-year, it's really critical that you're planning in advance so that that moment that first resident comes and your CAP starts, you're ready for the next. Courtney, what was your experience?
So I was slightly more fortunate than Susan in that we fell under that 5-year cap building period. While it was still fast and furious for those 5 years, even after an initial ramp up period of almost 2 years, because of the timing of where we were starting, our first classes of residence began in 2019, and we were shortly followed by the COVID pandemic in 2020 into 2021 and onward. So really, we had to be very cautious in terms of that overall cap development period when we made any adjustments to our plan. And unfortunately, due to some of the impacts to the faculty practices that we were planning to utilize, we did have to re-strategize and actually take one program off the table due to some limitations within that practice post-COVID. So really that impacted our planning for our TY program into a dermatology program, as that program was no longer a viable option for us to utilize both as a residency program and as a subspecialty training site. So really with the clinical volume shifts and that increased pressure from the health system due to all the financial impacts they were feeling, we also had to course correct on a number of rotations that were planned just due to the fact that patient volumes were no longer available in that post-pandemic environment and not expected to adequately increase. So doing things like Susan mentioned earlier of engaging multiple practices to serve the needs of our residents and our education specialists, just to ensure that no resident would not meet their graduation requirements. So that took a lot of strategic planning, some community engagement from community providers, and really put some extra pressure on that overall 5-year build.
Thank you. Moving on then to accreditation and application support. Once the hospital has decided to move forward, Germane Solutions assists in preparing for accreditation. This includes ensuring that all necessary documentation, faculty, and infrastructure are in place to meet the accreditation standards. What challenges did you face during the accreditation or application process, and how has Germane helped your hospital overcome those hurdles? This certainly can be a daunting process for many hospitals. Courtney, how was your experience?
So as you mentioned, it is very daunting. We lucked out with several programs who really we resolved the accreditation into an initial and then continued accreditation with very minor citations or areas for improvement. As you might expect, started with a couple of initial faculty scholarship citations or areas for improvement that the ACGME monitored, just coming from a non-academic environment. But we did have one particular challenge in our anesthesia residency, and that posed a couple of challenges because we were working with a contracted outside physician group, not an employed group. And so finding that right program director with the appropriate qualifications, trying to navigate getting them the appropriate dedicated administrative time, ensuring that that outside contracted physician group would provide the appropriate faculty availability, protected time versus the minimum requirements, and then making sure that their focus was not on service over education posed some very unique challenges that took several years to help resolve with that program. And what I can say there is Germane really partnered with us, stayed with us side by side each step of the way to make sure that we had the subject matter expertise we needed to form appropriate mentorship plans for the best qualified PD. While they weren't the perfect candidate, they were able to really help us develop that mentorship plan, enhance our strategy around how we can leverage both the contracted physician party and meet the needs of education, and then helped us to address a multitude of citations that came through our both initial and continuing accreditation site visit in those programs, simply because the program structure was a little bit unique. So providing expertise on ways we can address the citations, move forward, and make that program better and a better learning environment for the residents.
Thank you. Yeah, experience with 400 programs and 70 institutions becoming teaching has allowed us to see a lot over the years of different things that happen. One thing you mentioned with the contracted physician group is always a challenge. Certainly doable, but not without the proper understanding on both sides and desire to participate. So thank you for that. We're going to move on to the ongoing guidance and support, our last stage. Even after the initial planning and the accreditation phases, Germane remains engaged in your process. We want to offer ongoing support to the hospital as it implements its GME programs and ensure a smooth transition into becoming a full-fledged teaching hospital. So this is step 9, but we continue kind of expanding on this step as there's a number of things that are here. The early transition phase focuses on establishing the foundational elements that are necessary. So we work with organization on things like space needs. You've heard some of that today from our panelists, key infrastructure, things that you don't always think of, such as, HR, IT, legal, how you deal with those things, as well as things that may be more familiar to you if you're in the teaching world, such as sim labs or faculty development resources. Integrating for successful GME expansion is kind of 9.2. So effective integration is really critical to the success of the programs. Strategic marketing, robust onboarding, integration of residents into the organization is critical. It sounds like that might be easy to do, but often if you're dealing with an organization that hasn't had residents, it's really a challenge to get even the nursing staff to accept that there's going to be a resident or anyone else in the organization. As programs mature, though, operational efficiency becomes a little bit more of the key and kind of moving along with those efforts on building engagement and capacity within the organization. After the initial steps are complete, how did Germane Solutions ensure your hospital was supported through the ongoing implementation of GME? Did Germane Solutions' long-term involvement make a difference? Both institutions had different levels of ongoing involvement from Germane, providing essential support through the full GME transition. Susan, do you want to talk about the level that you had?
Yeah, we actually, when we first worked with Germane, they gave us the original feasibility and evaluation as well as the financials. Then they pretty much stepped out of the organization, but we brought them back in to review our resident FTE reporting and making sure that we were reporting appropriately and we were going to hit our board approved targets for our initial GME proposal. This external validation really helped us surpass our benchmarks and secured the resources that we needed to continue to improve our growth. The guidance from Germane has been very critical to our program's ability to expand and adapt.
That's great to hear. Courtney, I know we were a little more involved with your organization. What kind of things did you see?
Yeah, so I can say sitting on the institutional side that many of you all on the call are on, I really appreciated the partnership that Germane provided from years sort of -2 through 5, all of that initial planning. And then as we moved through the program development, we really invested in maintaining that relationship with Germane as our subject matter expert partners, and found that that support was critical as we developed our infrastructure, our operational best practices, making sure that each of our programs had the robust expertise of the Germane team for their continuing accreditation site visits. So keeping Germane on through all of that process. Uniquely, we also were able to leverage Germane for some interim staffing needs when we had our director of graduate medical education step out unexpectedly, and then down the road when we had a little bit of program coordinator turnover. So being able to leverage the Germane team for that level of support as well was absolutely critical to successful ongoing operations of the program. And then they certainly stayed on to help us through our sponsoring institution continuing accreditation site visit, a lot of education and faculty development over those first 5 years, and then came in years 4 and 5 as well to do a full resident FTE review, including our IRIS report and cost reporting audits to make sure that we were capturing the maximum allowable FTE for each of our resident and towards the end of the cycle fellows to ensure we got the maximum reimbursement projected under those initial pro forma models. So really couldn't have done it without the Germane team on board.
It's been very exciting to see the success of both your organizations. I know we as a company really try to ensure success and helping in any areas as needed to kind of get you over that finish line and then ensure that you have continued success. So this concludes the question and answer part from our panelists. We'll now open the floor for any questions from the audience. If you do have a question, you can type it into the chat box. And we'll go ahead and start with one we received earlier. Susan, I'll let you take this one. What do you consider when putting physician compensation agreements in place?
First, you have to understand what are we asking the physicians to do, and what amount of time is it going to take them to do that work. Remember, these are very, very busy physicians who are seeing lots of patients, and they've really spent their entire time just doing RVU generation and making sure that they're meeting their objectives within their offices to support their clinical enterprise. So the key is really understanding what it is you're asking them to do, and then compensate them fairly. I really think that our all faculty should be at least compensated at the 50th percentile for the region based on their specialty. And then looking at the amount of time you're asking them for them to put into not just clinical time, but also administrative. What does that look like, and how can we address it with them so that they don't feel a pinch when they're looking at their finances later and say, well, wait a minute, I gave all that time to the GME program, and now I don't have the time I need to from a clinical perspective. So we make sure that we have a model that embraces their time and their commitment to our training programs. And we generated, in our organization, we generated a model which was an average of about 10% of their time was considered non-productive when they were doing supervision of the residents, so that we actually accounted for that and reimbursed them for that time.
Thank you. It sounds like a good plan. Courtney, did you have any other experiences?
Yeah, so similar to Susan, it was critical to us to develop a faculty compensation model that really provided sort of a net neutral impact to the faculty at hand, if not a little bit of a net benefit in those early years, making sure we accounted for any of their administrative time. Again, opting to look at some very particular survey data, making sure they were compensated at a percentile ranking equal to what their typical clinical productivity was. So if you're a 50th percentile clinical producer, that would mean a 50th percentile GME rate. Trying to standardize that as best we could across the specialties, and then also incorporating a mechanism for any of their teaching time that we actually captured in a little bit more detail through the GC modifier in the billing platform to make sure that they had some backfill to keep them whole on any of the clinical slowdown in those initial years. And what we did find is as the programs grew and got more mature, we needed to pay less and less of that clinical compensation time and really just move to much more of an administrative payment model.
Yeah, it really is a critical area and often not well understood in non-teaching organizations. So kind of studying that and looking at all the components. And you mentioned keeping whole, and that is typically something that people ask when they're considering if they want to participate or not. So thank you for those. I have one more question. How can a hospital successfully engage and train its existing physicians to be prepared to teach on day one once a GME strategy is adopted? Courtney, I'll let you go first.
Absolutely. So the strategy we took on that was to engage early and engage often. And really what that entailed was starting at the very basics with what is GME, what is a resident, and then building through the core expectations for all faculty members, for program directors, teaching them simple skills like how to be an effective bedside teacher, making sure they had the appropriate information and training they needed to give constructive and helpful feedback to their trainees, as they might have been out of the practice of doing that for a number of years in my institution. So really ensuring that they had forums for very focused faculty development, and also incorporating a lot of that development into our GMEC meetings as well, since all program directors were invited to attend there. So we would have very targeted breakout sessions in those types of forums when questions came to arise based on where they were in their planning phase. And then the goal really was to launch them with the most information we could on day one of their program, and make sure we were side by side, sort of white glove supporting them as they built that first year.
That's important. I love the white glove concept. Nice to have someone beside you. Susan, what kind of experience did you have with that?
I think only I'm going to add to that, because I think Courtney's right. You have to do it early and you have to do it often with the physicians. You can't assume that they understood and understand what is asked of them in the process. The important thing, though, is as the standards continue to change and the standards of evaluation continue to change, you need to continue to focus on treating and educating your physicians. And the other key is, I think, is really you need to bring them into the change process. How are you going to change your evaluation system to now migrate your evaluations into more of a CCC evaluation? So bring them into that process and get them to understand what's necessary, as well as help them help you with their design of getting that feedback from them so that it's much more readily available when you have to sit down and do your CCC evaluations.
Wow, that's all really critical. Well, at the end of our webinar, thank you to our presenters for the information and insights provided today. In wrapping up our session, we want to thank you all for participating. As noted earlier, you'll receive an email this afternoon with a short survey to complete, as well as a copy of the presentation. If you have any outstanding questions after today's presentation, please email Hunter Rich at hrich@germanesolutions.com. For additional educational information, please be on the lookout for future promotional materials. Details and registration for any upcoming webinars can be found on LinkedIn or on our website. Additionally, our marketing team will ensure that every participant in the webinar gets an email containing any sign-up links for upcoming webinars.